Roller coaster elements are meant to be enjoyed, and for the most part, the features of the roller coasters at Kings Island are enjoyable. However, on every ride, there is an underwhelming or uncomfortable moment, and this goes for every single coaster. These moments are essential to dissect so riders know what to expect on the rides. Here's the worst moment on every Kings Island thrill coaster. Starting with the first coaster heading around the park is Invertigo. Invertigo isn't necessarily a good ride. I rode it on opening day this year and it was not an enjoyable experience. The worst element was the backward vertical loop. I rode it in the front row, which could have something to do with it, but the backward loop was by far the shakiest element. Going forward, it's not horrible as you can brace for the very strong positives. However, going backward, the valley hits suddenly, whiplashing riders downward with the positives. In addition, the whole loop rattles back and forth, so there is minor headbanging along with these aggressive positives. This element, in my opinion, is the most painful in the park. Next up is one of the best coasters in the park, Banshee, a B&M Inver opening back in 2014. Banshee is a massive coaster, reaching speeds of 68 miles per hour during the pretzel knot inversion. However, the big complaint with this super intense coaster is the very strong rattle present throughout. Banshee definitely rattles riders, and the rattliest, and in my opinion the weakest element, is the second half of the pretzel knot, or the immelman. This inversion is where the fastest point of the ride is, and while the first half of the knot is smooth and incredibly forceful, the second inversion isn't as forceful with a very strong rattle throughout. Also, this immelman isn't that great of an inversion. Unlike the other elements, it isn't as floaty or sustained and is a forgettable inversion. However, all of the elements in Banshee are decent, and this immelman is no exception. With a park like Kings Island having so many great coasters, not a lot of these elements can really be considered bad. As just mentioned, there really isn't a bad moment on the bat, as most of the elements are extremely similar. Turns and minor drops are the main part of the bat, and there really aren't any unique moments on the ride. This makes the only moment without swinging, the first drop, the most underwhelming moment on the ride. This is a shallow drop, basically a ramp, with the valley being intense but also pretty aggressive, which could cause headbanging if not careful. While headbanging isn't likely, it's the only part of the bat where pain could be caused. Also, the drop is very short without much force and no swinging. Other than that, the only other elements on the bat are tight turns with enjoyable swinging, making the drop the most underwhelming element. Now leaving Action Zone, we run into Adventure Express, an aero mine train built in 1991. This mine train is pretty enjoyable, but there are some moments with harsh moments of whiplash. Now, I'm not including brake runs or lift hills, as if I was, the disappointing second lift would be the worst element. However, the worst element is in the second half, right before the downward tunnel. This element is a downward helix around some rock formations. The element looks decent on paper, but in reality, this element is the most uncomfortable on the ride. After the whiplash into the nearly unbanked turn, riders dive down into another jerk which levels the train out. These two jerks back to back without a lot of force make for an underwhelming and uncomfortable moment. Yes, I know that there are two sides to the racer. The blue side of racer is definitely the smoother side, but the worst element on both sides is the same. While the red side's version of this element is a little worse, they are both the worst element on a fantastic classic Woody. Right after the turnaround, there is a small airtime hill, then an extremely drawn out hill. This drawn out airtime hill is the worst element. It's the only element on this great wooden coaster without airtime. The long lead-in makes it worse. Also on the red side, this is the roughest element with the small jerk possible. The blue side doesn't have this roughness present, but it still doesn't have airtime. While there isn't a bad element on either of these coasters, this is the one that was most underwhelming. Flight of Fear is my least favorite major coaster in the park. I'm sure if the ride was outside it would be better, but because riders naturally brace for turns, Flight of Fear's dark nature makes it harder to enjoy. Every element is pretty jerky on Flight of Fear, not super painful, but just jerky, and because you can't brace, there is some whiplash possible. I know I stated that I wouldn't include brake runs, but I had to include the mid-course on Flight of Fear. The mid-course doesn't just slow the train, it completely stops riders dead in their tracks, and because of the banking and the tight trains, riders slowly tilt on their sides, hitting the hard plastic trains. It's very uncomfortable, especially because they are left in this position for about 5 to 10 seconds. It ruins the pacing, essentially stopping the ride, and is very uncomfortable. Flight of Fear is an okay coaster at best, but this element is the first one I think of whenever I think of Flight of Fear. Orion is the newest coaster in the park, opening in 2020, and similar to the other top tier coasters in the park, there really is not a bad element on this ride. All are good, but if there is one element I had to pick, it would be the first wave turn on the ride. However, it really isn't even a wave turn, just a high-speed bank turn. This hill is high above the ground and very fast, so riders can enjoy the speed on this element, but it's still the most underwhelming. While speed is fun, there is no airtime, no laterals, and no positives to enjoy. It's just a fast turn. I would have picked the drawn-out turnaround, but at least that has some whip into the element and positives on the exit. The wave turn is just a bit of a forgettable element on an otherwise great Giga coaster. Backlot Stunt Coaster, being a family coaster just like the Bat, doesn't have a lot of differentiation between elements. There isn't a painful element on the ride, but my least favorite element and the one that provides the least to the overall experience is the first high banked turn. This turn is right after the cop cars with the low to the ground turns. It's not a bad element by any means, it's just forgettable. There isn't a lot of force involved compared to the rest of the ride, and there is a chance for a little downwards jerk if riders don't brace for the sudden turn. There is no other element on the ride that I could have picked for this spot, so this bank turn by default is the worst element on the ride. The Beast is another ride where a lot of the elements are similar. Unlike Backlot, however, the Beast is a pure fun coaster and is arguably the most iconic coaster in the world. It consists of many straight sections and turns, which may sound boring, but with the classic rumble, tunnels, sharp turns, and especially that wooded setting, the Beast makes for a great experience. The worst element, unlike the rest of the ride though, isn't that exciting. This drawn-out covered straight section near Orion's back half is the worst element. It lasts forever and was one of the few sections that wasn't retracked, so it is still pretty bumpy. Also, at the end of this straight track is the strongest trim on the ride, which really kills the next couple of turns. Our second to last coaster is Mystic Timbers, and being the best ride and the most out of control in the park, there isn't really a rough element. However, there is definitely an underwhelming element. The only moment on this ride that doesn't provide any force or airtime is the floater hill after the tunnel turnaround. It's surrounded by ejector hills, so it's a forgettable moment, but this floater airtime hill has no airtime. The valleys are still full of positives, but it is the most underwhelming element on this absolutely insane coaster. Again, Kings Island has a ride with not a lot of different elements. Diamondback is a B&M hyper, so the only real elements are turns and camelbacks, making it hard to pick the worst. However, Diamondback has one standout element that I easily thought of. Right after the sharp turnaround is this airtime hill, with a trim that is easily felt. The trim ruins the airtime on this hill. Every other hill on the ride is powerful except for this one. Additionally, the valley right before this has the strongest rattle in the park, which has left me with a headache after riding before. Again, a B&M hyper is still a B&M hyper, so there really isn't a bad moment, but a strong rattle and trimmed hill make this airtime moment disappointing. You can really tell that with a coaster collection as great as Kings Island, there really isn't a bad moment on most of these coasters. The worst is probably Invertigo's or Flight of Fears. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Comment on what you think the worst moments on Kings Island's coasters are, and have a great rest of your day.